The philosophical demolition. To understand modernism, we must begin where it began, with the systematic demolition of the philosophical assumptions that had structured Western thought since the Enlightenment. This was not mere academic debate. It was an intellectual earthquake that shook the foundations of how people understood truth, morality, consciousness, and reality itself. Three thinkers stand as the primary architects of this demolition: Friedrich Nietzsche, Sigmund Freud, and Henri Bergson. Their ideas did not simply influence modernist artists. They made modernism possible by destroying the old framework and revealing the void beneath. Friedrich Nietzsche's work served as a major precursor to modernism, with his philosophy centered on psychological drives and specifically the will to power. But what does this actually mean, stripped of mystification? The will to power describes what Nietzsche believed to be the main driving force in humans, though he never systematically defined it, leaving interpretation open to debate. At its core, the will to power is the fundamental drive of all living things, not merely to survive, but to expand, to grow, to impose their strength on the world around them. This is not about political domination, though it can manifest there. It is about the basic impulse of life itself to overflow its current boundaries. Nietzsche thought that the will to power and struggle were more fundamental than a will to survive or mere self-preservation. This inverted everything. For centuries, Western philosophy had assumed that human beings were fundamentally rational creatures seeking happiness, security, or salvation. Nietzsche said no. We are fundamentally drives and forces seeking to actualize our power. Reason is not the master of the house. It is a tool that these deeper drives employ to achieve their ends. The implications were staggering. Nietzsche's criticisms relied on psychological diagnoses that exposed false consciousness infecting people's received ideas, which is why he is associated with advancing a hermeneutics of suspicion against traditional values. What this means concretely is that Nietzsche taught people to distrust their own conscious motivations. When someone claims to act morally, Nietzsche asks, what unconscious resentment or will to power is actually driving this? When a culture celebrates certain values as universal truths, Nietzsche asks, whose power does this serve? His most explosive idea was the death of God. This was not a celebration. Nietzsche understood that the death of God meant the collapse of the entire moral and metaphysical structure of Western civilization. His provocative ideas, including the death of God and the Übermensch, were revolutionary for modernism because he rejected absolute truths and gave modernists a philosophical foundation for embracing creativity and questioning norms. If there is no God, then there are no objective moral truths written into the fabric of reality. Values are human creations, expressions of will to power, nothing more. This created a crisis. Either humans would sink into nihilism and despair, or they would have to become creators of their own values. Nietzsche challenged traditional morals and encouraged a life defined by individual purpose. The Übermensch, or Overman, was his response to nihilism, a figure who could live without the crutch of external validation or transcendent meaning, who could create values rather than merely inherit them. This idea profoundly shaped modernist thinking about the role of the artist. The artist became, in modernist imagination, a kind of Übermensch who creates meaning through aesthetic innovation in a world stripped of inherent purpose. Nietzsche consistently critiqued the Western conception of the rational subject which portrays reason or mind as a higher faculty governing the body, instead affirming a materialist perspective that took seriously human needs and drives. This demolition of the rational subject was crucial for modernism. If human beings are not fundamentally rational, if consciousness is just the surface of deeper drives, then the whole Enlightenment project of using reason to achieve progress becomes questionable. Modernist literature would obsessively explore this fractured subject, showing characters driven by forces they do not understand, consciousness fragmented and unstable. The second great demolisher was Sigmund Freud. Central to Freud's thinking is the idea of the primacy of the unconscious mind in mental life, so that all subjective reality was based on interactions between basic drives and instincts through which the outside world was perceived. Think about what this means. When you believe you are thinking rationally, making free choices, understanding reality clearly, Freud says you are actually responding to unconscious drives, repressed memories, and mechanisms of defense that operate completely outside your awareness. Your conscious mind is not the author of your thoughts. It is their interpreter, and often a poor one. Freud's description of subjective states involved an unconscious mind full of primal impulses and counterbalancing self-imposed restrictions derived from social values. Human consciousness in this view is a battleground. On one side are primitive drives seeking immediate gratification. On the other side are internalized social rules and moral commands. What we experience as our conscious self is the compromise formation between these warring forces. We are not unified subjects. We are fractured, conflicted, driven by desires we cannot acknowledge. Freud's psychoanalysis revealed the unconscious mind's influence over thoughts, dreams, and desires. This revelation transformed how modernist artists approached representation. If much of human motivation is unconscious, then realistic depictions of conscious thought miss the deeper truth. Modernist techniques like stream of consciousness, fragmentation, and dream logic were attempts to represent this newly discovered psychic reality. The chaotic, associative flow of Mrs. Dalloway's thoughts in Virginia Woolf's novel is not just an artistic experiment. It is an attempt to show consciousness as Freud revealed it to be, not orderly and rational, but fluid, associative, driven by forces below the surface. Henri Bergson, on the other hand, emphasized the difference between scientific clock time and the direct subjective human experience of time. This might seem like an obscure philosophical point, but it had revolutionary implications. Scientific time, the time measured by clocks, is uniform and objective. Each second is identical to every other second. But our lived experience of time is nothing like this. Sometimes an hour flies by in what feels like minutes. Sometimes 5 minutes of anxiety feels like an eternity. Which time is real? Bergson's notion of duration, a concept of time as subjective and fluid, opposed deterministic views of time as linear and fixed. For Bergson, real time is duration, the continuous flow of lived experience that cannot be divided into discrete moments. When we try to measure time scientifically, we spatialize it, we freeze it into measurable units. But this destroys what time actually is in our experience. A flowing, interpenetrating continuity where past and present are not separate but merge into each other through memory. Bergson's work on time and consciousness had a great influence on 20th century novelists, especially modernists who used the stream of consciousness technique. Writers like James Joyce and Virginia Woolf were not simply being difficult or experimental for its own sake. They were trying to represent consciousness as it actually operates in Bergsonian time, where memories intrude into present perceptions, where the boundary between now and then dissolves. The famous final section of Joyce's Ulysses, Molly Bloom's unpunctuated interior monologue, is an attempt to capture this duration, this flow of consciousness in lived time rather than clock time. Bergson's philosophy also featured the idea of élan vital, the life force that brings about the creative evolution of everything, and he placed high value on intuition without rejecting the importance of intellect. This concept gave modernists a philosophical justification for privileging intuition, instinct, and creative impulse over rational analysis. If there is a vital force driving evolution and creativity, then perhaps the artist who follows intuition is accessing something deeper than rational planning could achieve. This was not anti-intellectualism. It was a repositioning of the relationship between different modes of knowing, giving intuitive and emotional knowledge equal or superior status to rational analysis. At its core, modernist philosophy is characterized by a rejection of traditional notions of truth and reality, an emphasis on subjective experience and individual perspective, and a critique of Enlightenment values and rationality. But we must be precise about what this rejection entailed. Modernists were not saying there is no truth whatsoever. They were saying that truth is not a simple correspondence between our ideas and an objective external reality. Truth is perspectival, constructed, dependent on the standpoint from which one views. This does not make it arbitrary or meaningless, but it does make it plural and contested. Modernist thinkers argued that traditional notions of truth and reality are based on outdated metaphysical and epistemological assumptions that no longer hold. The Enlightenment had assumed that through reason and scientific method, we could progressively uncover objective truths about reality and use these truths to improve human life. But the late 19th and early 20th centuries revealed the limitations of this faith. Science had produced not just progress, but also weapons of mass destruction. Reason had produced not just enlightenment, but also efficient systems of oppression. Industrialization had created wealth, but also alienation and exploitation. The Enlightenment project was not delivering on its promises. Modernist philosophy placed strong emphasis on subjective experience and individual perspective, arguing that individual experience and perception are the primary sources of knowledge and understanding. This was not solipsism. It was a recognition that we cannot step outside our own perspective to access some view from nowhere. All knowledge is knowledge from somewhere, filtered through particular minds with particular histories. The question then becomes not how to eliminate perspective and achieve objectivity, but how to acknowledge and work with the inescapable perspectival nature of human knowledge. Modernist philosophy was characterized by a critique of Enlightenment values and rationality, arguing that the Enlightenment's emphasis on reason and rationality led to neglect of other important aspects of human experience like emotion, intuition, and creativity. This was perhaps the most fundamental break. The Enlightenment had believed that reason, properly applied, was the solution to human problems. Modernism said that reason itself might be part of the problem. Not that reason is useless or should be abandoned, but that its hegemony over other ways of knowing had created an impoverished and potentially dangerous form of life. Instrumental rationality, the calculating reason that figures out efficient means to ends, had triumphed, but it could not answer the question of which ends are worth pursuing. It could tell you how to build an atomic bomb with ruthless efficiency, but it could not tell you whether you should. These three thinkers, Nietzsche, Freud, and Bergson, did not work in isolation. They were part of a broader cultural crisis where old certainties were collapsing, but they gave that crisis philosophical articulation. They provided the concepts and frameworks that allowed modernist artists to make sense of their own experiences of fragmentation, alienation, and the inadequacy of traditional forms. The will to power, the unconscious duration. These were not just abstract ideas. They were tools for understanding a world that had become incomprehensible through traditional lenses. The demolition these thinkers carried out was thorough. The rational subject, the objective world, universal moral truths, linear time, the primacy of consciousness, all of these foundational assumptions were called into question or rejected outright. This created enormous anxiety. While modernism regarded fragmentation as tragic and lamented the loss of unity, hoping to regain it through art, postmodernism would later celebrate fragmentation. Modernists were not happy about the collapse of certainty. They experienced it as loss, as tragedy. Their art was often an attempt to create new forms of unity and meaning in the absence of the old guarantees. But the demolition also created tremendous intellectual and creative freedom. If there are no fixed rules, if reality is not given but constructed, if consciousness is not a unified rational subject but a flowing multiplicity, then entirely new forms of art and thought become possible. The price of this freedom was high: uncertainty, anxiety, the constant risk of nihilism. But modernism chose to pay that price rather than cling to comforting illusions. This philosophical courage, this willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about reality and consciousness, is what gives modernism its intellectual power and its lasting relevance.